Good morning. You're watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training. It's Monday the 27th of April and we're moving into the 6th week of lockdown here in London. I've got a very special interview for you this morning with Dr Chris Hurren, who's a materials scientist from Deakin University in Australia. And Chris is at the centre of the MotoCAP motorcycle clothing rating system. So with no further ado, let's go over to Chris and find out all about the MotoCAP rating system.
Right.
Okay. Welcome everybody to today's interview, which I'm recording with Dr Chris Hurren of Deakin University from Australia. Now, last week we listened to Paul Varnsbury, who filled us in on the history of protective motorcycle clothing. And he told us how the original Cambridge standard came about, the development of the original level 1 and level 2 standards, and how that's recently been superseded by EN 17092. Now, as well as lowering the bar for the abrasion resistance to a point where Paul was concerned that the lowest A standard was set too low, Paul also flagged up a reduction in protection due to a modification of the injury risk zones from the original 4-zone scheme developed by Dr Woods and to a new 3-zone scheme, which moves some of the areas previously seen as requiring a higher level of protection into a lower zone. So what today's all about is to meet Dr Hurren and to go over the independent MotoCAP scheme that's been evolving down south in Australia and New Zealand. So what we want to do is find out how Chris is involved, how MotoCAP came about, what's tested and what useful information the MotoCAP scheme gives to riders. So, okay, over to you, Chris, to start with then. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are? How did you get into the role of testing for bike clothing generally?
Yeah, definitely. Good to talk with you, Kevin. I'm a scientist at Deakin University. I worked in the textile industry for a number of years, and then I went to a university environment and worked for the university for 10 years. But over that time, or over about a 6-year period, I did a PhD part-time, which meant that I could go down the research stream. So since about 2010, I've been full research, and I research all sorts of different textile type projects. So everything from sutures that we would use to do shoulder surgery through to warmer sailing gear. And of course, you can see in the background a couple of my motorcycles. I have a love of motorcycles, and so for me to do protective motorcycle clothing was just a sensible transition.
Okay, so next question then. You've been working on this MotoCAP standard. Can you tell us briefly what it is and what your role in the MotoCAP scheme is?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Chief Scientist of MotoCAP. Myself, Dr Liz de Rome, Paul Varnsbury and Dr Tom Gibson from Human Impact Engineering in Australia, we got together to develop the protocol on behalf of a number of different states in Australia and also the New Zealand ACCC, so the state governments of Australia, road safety groups, and also the Australian Motorcycle Riders Association and the Australian Motorcycle Council were heavily involved in us putting together MotoCAP. So we developed a set of protocol that enable us to buy garments off the shelf, bring them into the laboratory, cut them up, test them, and put a comprehensive set of results online to enable a rider to determine a good product and a bad product. Now, what we do is we have protection levels, and we've tried to use something that everyone knows, which is a star rating system, similar to what you would have on a motor vehicle or a refrigerator. We all know 5 stars is good and 1 star is not so good, and we've used that system to continue through to rate the protection and the thermal comfort of motorcycle clothing.
Okay, that was. I was going to say that you don't just test the abrasion resistance, but if we come on to the other properties of the garments in just a moment, let's just
Yeah.
talk about how protective a garment is in a slide to start with. What's the background to the testing work you've done on these abrasion resistant properties of bike clothing?
So we look at not just abrasion resistance. So when we look at the protection in MotoCAP, we've looked at the tests that we can do to enable us to understand the protection of a garment. So if we look at it, we have abrasion, we have the strength of the seams, and we have how good the armour is that's contained in the garment. And so each of these three components we measure. If you look, some of the earlier motorcycle standards and also the current motorcycle standard measure the tear resistance of a fabric. And we could have gone down that path, but for simplicity, we haven't measured tear resistance because the burst test that we do will help us to understand the tear resistance of that fabric to a certain extent. So with abrasion, we rank abrasion being the highest risk when you fall from a motorcycle. If you look at it when you're sliding down the road, and for soft tissue injury that we're going to have the most effect on, abrasion is very important. So we rank abrasion first, we rank impact second, and we rank seam strength third. And we will test each of those elements, give them each a score, and then those scores go together to give us an overall star rating for the protection level of a garment.
Right. Okay, that answers that question. I suppose the most important question of the lot then is actually how do you test the materials in your laboratory? If we start with the abrasion resistance and then deal with that first of all, it's probably a logical way of doing it. It's the the element that I think most people would focus on. I realise the other elements are important, but certainly it's the kind of one that I kind of think of when I wearing kit, and I'll tell you why later.
And so abrasion, with MotoCAP, what we tried to do was not to reinvent the wheel. So the three tests that we use for abrasion, for armour energy absorption, and for seam strength are the same tests that we used in EN 13595. So we're using the standard test methods that were used in the original European standard. Abrasion, what we use is the Cambridge Impact Abrasion Tester that was developed by Roderick Woods back in the early 90s. I've actually physically met with Roderick in a visit to the UK, which was most enjoyable. We've done a lot of work on that abrasion tester. So yes, we use that abrasion tester to measure our samples, but we've also built an abrasion tester the same as what we use in the laboratory that will fit onto the back of a car, on the tow bar of a car. And we've been able to compare what we get in the laboratory to what we actually get on road surfaces. So we know now from our scientific work that the times that we're using that we're measuring on our abrasion tester in our laboratory are very similar to the chip seal surfaces that we would find in New Zealand and find in Australia for abrasion damage. Now, I'm in the process of gathering that for other places in the world, and we hope to have some more information on road surfaces in the UK and Europe and also America to do that. So what we do is we drop a sample onto an abrasive belt, which is a 60 grit sandpaper, and we measure how long it takes to form a hole through that sample.
Okay, right. So moving on, really, why is it then that Australia isn't subject to CE standards? So why are you bothering to compare your results with the CE results?
So MotoCAP come about because of the lack of information for riders. So if we go back 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when MotoCAP was a concept, almost nothing in store was rated. There was maybe, if you went into a typical motorcycle store for clothing, maybe 10 garments in the entire store of 500 or 1,000 different garment types would actually be rated to the CE standard. So there was a lack of information there for riders.
Right, we're just hanging on a minute. We're just breaking up a
So
little bit.
when a rider goes into a store, okay, how do we go now? We got better sound quality now?
We're just having a bit of a problem with the internet at the moment. Right, okay, it seems to have settled down again.
How's that? Have you got me clearly now?
Yeah, that sounds all right. Right, okay, so if we can just go back to the that question again, what's the reason?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll just ask the question again then. Okay, so Australia is not subject to the CE standards, so why the interest in Australia on the comparative tests using your machinery and the CE standard?
So to start off with, riders wanted a star rating system. They didn't want a standard in Australia. When you get a standard, your product either passes or it fails. So how do you know how good that product is? It may have just passed or it may have passed significantly. And so we look at helmets. Helmets, we can go on to Sharp or to Crash, and we can have a look and see how well that helmet actually does. It passes a standard, but it might only have a low level of energy absorption in the front of the forehead. But we can see that this other one that also passes the same standard has a very high level of energy absorption in the forehead. So our physical rider in Australia wanted information. They didn't want just a pass-fail. They didn't want a standard brought in, because a standard could have the implications that you have to wear standard clothing, like what happens in France, where a star rating left it totally up to them to make the decision of what they're going to ride in. The other reason we introduced the star rating system was just lack of information. You walk into a store, although we had a CE standard, almost nothing hanging on the shelves was CE certified. So it meant it was very hard for a rider to choose good gear. With a star rating system, they can have a look before they go into the store, and eventually we hope that manufacturers will come on board with the star rating and will start to swing tag, so riders will get more information in the store. But it meant that we can make, as a rider, when we go into a store, we can make a decision and buy something that we know is protective. The other reason we went down a path of a star rating is it's independent of the manufacturers. So the system goes into a store in either New Zealand or Australia randomly with a secret shopper, and they buy the clothing that we're going to use for testing. So the person selling the clothing to us has no idea that it will be used for testing. The company that manufactures that clothing does not know that we will be picking it up. And so that means that the clothing we get is independent to the manufacturer. It hasn't been made specially to pass the standard. It is exactly the clothing that we would be wearing if we're to ride a bike. We then buy a second one online so that we're able to test two next to each other, so that we make sure that we're getting quality control testing. We're not finding that one's been prepared really well and one's down a lot lower. So it means that we can get an understanding of how the performance of that clothing is. And so all of this comes together to give the riders the information they need, or as I use MotoCAP as well when I buy clothing, so that we know what we're going to buy when we buy an item of clothes.
Okay, so that justifies the MotoCAP rating system. What's the significant difference between the machinery that you use? You mentioned you're using something based on Roderick Wood's original machine, and the machine that's used for the CE certification process, which is, I know, the Darmstadt machine.
So the ART, the AART or Darmstadt machine, is quite an interesting concept. What you do is you spin the samples up to a certain speed, up to 120 kilometers an hour. You then drop them down 10 millimeters until they land on a concrete pad. So that they then will wear on that concrete pad until they'll spin around undriven until they come to a stop from their own speed. So as a rider, it's really easy to say, oh, look, I crash at 120 kilometers an hour. The fabric is dropped onto the concrete pad, and it's spent it's slowed down until it comes to a stop. Exactly the same as what would happen when I crash. So the test itself is quite an interesting test. There is still some questions that need to be answered about the test. When the test was originally developed, was about 30 years ago or 40 years ago. I've tried to get literature on the test. I have a small amount that has been provided to me from Deakin University, but there's not been the scientific understanding of that test with regards to crash injury as what there is in the Cambridge machine. So for us, it was far better for us to go with the Cambridge machine, where Roderick Woods had done quite a lot of work on understanding the levels of damage on clothing and comparing that to the test. And also people like Liz Derome, I'm trying to think, there's a couple of other researchers in Australia, have done a lot of work to compare the abrasion times that we get on the Cambridge machine and the probability of soft tissue injury from people that have actually crashed and turned up at emergency. And so from that, the Cambridge machine was more interesting to us because it enabled us to know that if you're turning up at emergency, your likelihood of being injured if you're wearing 4-second clothing on our abrasion tester or on the Cambridge abrasion tester, you have about a 20% probability of having soft tissue injury. If you go to a 1-second abrasion time, then you go up to about a 60% probability of having soft tissue injury if you're turning up at emergency. Now, this was most of the emergency work that was done for that particular paper was both in Sydney and in a rural environment. So there was a mixture of both asphalt and chip seal roads. And the work is not perfect because the crashes only looked at people that turned up at emergency. They didn't look at the people that crashed their motorbike, got up and walked away without any injuries. So those percentages would probably come down a little bit, but it enabled us to understand that there was a very good relationship between injury levels and the times that we would get on the Cambridge machine. Now, for me, I've also, as a scientist, as I said, we've been able to go further than that. We've now attached a whole heap of different fabrics to the on-road abrasion tester and dropped them onto an actual road surface. And we know that for chip seal surfaces, our abrasion tester is pretty much getting exactly the same time as what we would get dropping that sample onto a chip seal surface. And when we go to an asphalt surface, like what we have in an urban environment, then we're going to get 2 to 3 and sometimes 4 times longer before we wear a hole through our sample. And so for us with MotoCAP, it means that the message is, if you're riding in an urban environment, then you really want to be in 2-star or better clothing. And if you're riding in a higher speed or rural environment, then you want to be in 3-star or better clothing.
Right, that kind of answers the next question as well, because I was about to say that last week I interviewed Paul Varnsbury, who gave us a lot of background. But he used his technical knowledge to essentially describe the more recent A standard of the newer tests as a rubber stamp standard. What he said basically was that it didn't challenge the manufacturers to make better clothing, but lowered the bar so that what they're already making can now become an approved garment. Do you care to comment on that?
So we are seeing a lot of clothing that's coming through in MotoCAP that has been CE certified to either the provisional standard 17092, or we're starting now to get clothing that's certified to the actual standard 17092. We're seeing clothing that is, I would class as being very low abrasion that's coming through that's been certified to that standard. Recently, we had 2 hoodie garments that only had abrasion protection in the elbow and the shoulder in a very small amount that were classified A under the new standard, that were essentially just hoodies. They were no different to a polycotton fleecy hoodie that you would go out and buy. They had pretty much the same protection levels as that, yet they'd met A under the new standard. They're an example. I could list off 10 or 12 that we've seen that are particularly low. In the early days of the Darmstadt machine starting to be conceived to be used in the standard, I went out and I sent some denim samples to 2 different testing houses in Europe. Both of those achieved the 75 km/h test speed that is the higher abrasion resistance of the AA standard. And this was essentially a piece of denim that you would find in a pair of 501 Levi's. We actually cut the denim out of a pair of 501 Levi's to send them over. Brand new pair of pants, so they weren't accident damaged or wear damaged in any way. But still, that same fabric was getting 0.6 of a second on our abrasion tester, on the Cambridge abrasion tester, which equates to about 5 meters of sliding distance before you have a hole in it on chip seal. So for me, personally, I feel that that's probably set a little bit low. I haven't got any accurate tests of the AAA, but I probably didn't send the right sort of materials, but I really wanted to understand where it was set at with a piece of denim, because everyone understands, most riders know that if you fall off a motorbike in a pair of denim jeans, ordinary denim jeans, not protective denim jeans, you're highly likely to have some sort of injury. And so it was easy for people to compare against. So although I like the test, I think it's probably set up for an urban environment. They have a concrete pad that, if you read the literature on the test, is said to resemble an asphalt surface. From our testing, we know that asphalt is 3 to 4 times less abrasive than a chip seal surface. So what we know from limited testing, concrete is less abrasive than that again. So it's possibly the mechanisms of the test. And for me, I would have liked to have seen maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when they were muting the idea of the Darmstadt machine, a direct comparison between the Darmstadt machine and the Cambridge machine.
Right, okay. Well, it might interest you to know that years ago, when I was young, poor, invulnerable and stupid, I fell off in a pair of denim jeans, ordinary denim jeans. You probably know we used to have electric milk floats delivering milk to houses. Yep, so they had a top speed of about 12 miles an hour or something. And I was overtaking one on a corner when I came off, so I was probably doing no more than about 20 miles an hour myself, so about 30 kph by, I think that is. And what happened was they failed almost from the hip, most of the way down the thigh. And as far as I can remember from the crash, what I noticed was that the loose material in the thigh had actually folded over the top of the seam, and presumably then stood proud of the rest of the garment. So it acted as a sort of a limited surface for the abrasion to take place on. And then it just basically gone down the seam for about that length. So I picked the bike up, as you do, continued my journey, because I was on the way out to college in London at the time, and I had a 40-mile ride in front of me. And at the end of the 40-mile ride, I had a 3-hour exam, because it was my exam period. So I had to sit through the exam with blood running down my leg, and then make it to the medical centre about 4 hours after I crashed, for what felt like the wire brush and hot acid treatment to get rid of the sort of grit and stuff out of the injury. So that particular crash fell, it's pretty much stuck in mind with me. Is that the kind of failure that you see on abrasion-resistant clothing, the poorer classes of abrasion-resistant clothing?
Definitely. The one that is most concerning is the protective textile market. It's marketed as being ballistic nylon and special fibres and all sorts of different things, but most of the fabrics, where they're 600 denier and single layer, generally get the same amount of abrasion time on our test machine as what a piece of denim does. When we go out onto actual road surfaces, they perform in exactly the same manner. So I sometimes wondered if it was the Cambridge machine being a little bit harsh on them, but no, when we actually go out onto a chip seal or onto an asphalt surface, they don't last that well. Now, fortunately, when we wear these products, we tend to have armour present in them. So if we're wearing a textile jacket, for instance, it will have armour in the elbows and shoulders. So if we crash, we're going to get that extra protection from the armour. So the outside fabric may fail partially or quite significantly, but the elbow or the shoulder is going to be protected. The problem comes where we land on our back. Now, if we don't have armour in our back, and if we look at most textile jackets, they're generally just one layer of 600 denier polyester or 600 denier nylon in the back, this sort of material will wear through quite quickly. And it's similar to what we have on the fronts and sides, but very much more importantly, it's what's on the bottom of our pants and generally the sides of the legs of our wet weather pants where we don't have any armour present. And these are high risk areas when we slide down the road. The work that Roderick's done and the work that 3 other researchers have done in the world have shown that Roderick's original template for injuries is valid for 3 different countries so far. So.
Okay, so far we've flagged up then the material makes a difference. 600 denier. What would be quite useful for people to see is actually how to recognise that. One of the problems I have is looking at a garment and trying to work out whether I'm looking at something which is a thin thread or a thick thread. I think I showed you my aero stitch while we were over in New Zealand, and that has I think it's 1,000 denier on the shoulders and the other sort of the bits that are likely to touch down, but the rest I think is a 600 denier, fairly standard looking fabric. Presumably the bigger the denier, the more protective the garment generally is. Is that correct?
That's correct, because essentially the higher the denier, the thicker the fabric, the more protection you get. Now, beautifully for us, most manufacturers will actually say this is made from 600 denier or 500 denier or 1,000 denier, or I've seen up to 1,800 denier used. What we also need to think about is layers. So if you have a single layer of fabric, it will get, say, 4 meters of sliding time. But if we have 2 layers of that same fabric, it will probably get 12 meters of sliding distance, not 8 meters. It doesn't double, it actually goes up higher. If we have 3 layers of that same fabric, it will be getting up around the 30 to 35 meters of sliding distance before we get a hole going through it. So when we're looking for those, the best wet weather jacket that we want to buy, you want to be looking to see that the extra fabric that they're put into the elbow and shoulder is actually sewn over the top of the body fabric, because then that gives you 2 layers or 3 layers in the shoulder and elbow region. And if we look at a jacket, we're highly likely to slide on this part of our body, from our wrist right up to our shoulder. There's a little bit of a section in here that we're less likely to slide on, and the front of our arm is very high likelihood of sliding on. So if you've got 2 layers of fabric in there, or preferably 3 layers of 600 denier fabric in there, you're getting to be quite a reasonable protective product. Now, one of the things that we've done with MotoCAP is that we've given things stars, because when Roderick set the original standard, the world was very much a leather world. Textiles was very minimal, and urban textiles like what we have in our denims and that sort of thing didn't exist. Now, where the standards were set were probably a bit high. So the 4 seconds and the 7 seconds on the Cambridge machine, getting to be into pretty premium high quality products at that sort of level of abrasion. I'm of the opinion that there needed to be something a bit lower than that and a bit lower again. And so the French were actually onto it quite nicely. They had a version of the 17092 for an urban environment, And we've done that with MotoCAP. If you look, a 3-star product is starting to come in at where that 4-second mark was of abrasion, and a 5-star product is coming in at that 7-second of abrasion time. But a 2-star is more than appropriate for riding around in an urban environment. So it's getting people to realise that there's different levels that are out there to select the right sort of clothing for what they're going to be doing. And I always say to people, if you're riding in any form of protective clothing, you're better than riding in none. So just having a protective textile jacket, even if it's only a 600 denier protective textile jacket with armour in, is going to be much better than riding in a fleecy jumper or a t-shirt when you're riding your motorcycle, or riding your scooter. So it's really, really important to have some gear on, and then for you to choose the level of protection that you want so that you're that little bit better protected.
Okay, so layers are better than a single layer. What I comment on that is that you've got to be a little bit careful that what you're not seeing is a cosmetic patch, which actually isn't a patch at all, but something simply sewn over a hole in the layer below it. I've seen leather jackets like that. But you can generally tell if you kind of roll the fabric in your thumbs and fingers, you can feel that there's a double thickness there. So that's a useful tip I'd give people.
If you're buying something that hasn't been tested on MotoCAP, and of course we test Australian and New Zealand stuff, so there is a lot of European stuff, European clothing in there that we test, but not everything that hangs on the shelf in Europe will be there. But if you're buying something and you're unsure, start to zip it and open it up and have a look in underneath the comfort mesh and really investigate into it and try and work out how many layers it is. Now, the layering is quite interesting. If we wear one pair of denim jeans, it will get 0.6 of a second on the abrasion tester. If we wear 2 pairs of denim jeans, it will get 2 seconds on our abrasion tester. If we wear 3 pairs of denim jeans, you'll actually get up to CE level 1 of the old standard in an abrasion protection. You'll get 4 seconds. So it doesn't have to be super high-end fabrics. You're looking at thickness and you're looking at no stretch. The second you go into stretchy products, protection goes down significantly. So if you look at something like a hoodie, or you look at something like a lady's leggings where there's stretch, generally there is much, much less protection, because stretch is our enemy when it comes to abrasion and seam strength or burst strength when we first hit the ground.
Right, okay. I remember one of the other comments you made was that woven and knitted fabrics have different properties. What's the difference? And for the consumer, how can you actually tell what you're looking at? The last time I knitted anything, I was trying to knit a scarf with my mother when I was about 6 years old, and ended up knitting a triangle.
So most knitted garments are stretchy, and so our t-shirt that we buy, a lot of people don't realise, but a t-shirt is a knitted product. And the easiest way of telling whether it's woven or knitted is to grab it and to pull on it. Now, if it's woven, it generally won't stretch very much. You maybe will get 5% of stretch on its length. It'll go, so if it's 10 centimetres long, it'll go to at the most 11 centimetres long, 5 or 10% stretch. If it's a knitted product, it will generally go significantly more, 50, 100, 150% stretch. And if you look at my t-shirt, you can see it stretches in the fabric. It's a knitted product. So if you're looking at outer fabrics, the bits that are going to hit the road, you want them to not stretch. But then if you're looking at inner layers, such as a para-aramid or Kevlar or Vectran or Covec or one of these protective liners on the inside of a garment, you want that to be knitted, because knitted actually has better abrasion resistance than woven. So we have the no stretch to get us through hitting the ground. And then we have the knitted stuff on the inside to get us through sliding along the ground. Because when we crash, there's 2 stages, and this is why we do both abrasion resistance and seam strength when we measure with MotoCAP. We have, in the first 7 to 10 milliseconds of hitting the ground, our clothing will grip up with the ground, And if the seams aren't strong enough or the fabric's not strong enough, it will just burst open. We actually have a tensile force occur between the part of the body that hits the ground and the bit that pulls on the fabric. And so seam strength is a really good way of understanding that, because either our seam will fail or the fabric will fail, and that will represent the original grip with the ground. Then once we get through that grip, we go into slip. And once we start slipping along the ground, unless we get airborne again significantly and hit the ground again hard, we won't get that grip phase to occur again. So then the abrasion resistance of a fabric becomes really critical. And so we need non-stretchy fabrics to get through that grip phase, and then we need protective layers or multiple layers of fabric or leather to get us through that slip phase, because in all of our testing, leather is still the best.
Crushing's a lot more complicated than most people realise, isn't it?
It is, but that's why you have people like me that are obsessed with what they do, that spend their time to understand what's happening. I'm out in my workshop at the moment because I'm an avid builder of my own test rigs, and I was showing you before, I have my own lathe and milling machine and other bits and pieces of equipment. And the abrasion tester that we have that fits into the tow bar of a car, that is the same as a Cambridge type machine, was actually built in this workshop. And so I like to understand why. It's no good to just test the clothing. You need to understand, are we doing the right tests? And that's why that abrasion tester for the car come about. Is it's no good MotoCAP providing advice and saying this is 5 stars and this is 4 and 3 and 2 and 1 if we don't understand the science of what happens when we hit the road. And so now we're starting to get quite confident that we know that science. And one of the bits of work that we've just recently done was to do abrasion testing with our Cambridge type impact abrasion tester at a range of different speeds. Because people always say, oh, the Cambridge machine is irrelevant because it only tests at 28 kilometres an hour or 8 metres a second of abrasion speed. And it keeps that constant speed over the entirety of the test. So that's not relevant to me crashing at 60 miles an hour on a motorway. I don't slide at 28 kilometres an hour or 8 metres a second during that crash, apart from a very short window. So what we did was with our on-road testing machine, we dropped samples on the ground from 5 kilometres an hour up to 50 kilometres an hour. And we tested about 30 or 40 test samples over that test speed. And we're able to put together a nice indication of abrasion time versus speed. Now, we thought originally that it would be linear. The faster you go, the shorter the abrasion time. So because our hypothesis or our question that we're trying to answer was, is it the amount of interaction you have with the road surface or the speed that you have with the road surface that has an effect? And so our thoughts were, it was the number of bits that you hit on the surface that will rip bits out of your clothing. And we were actually correct with that, but there was a little tiny twist on that. So at 5 kilometres an hour or 5 miles an hour, if I grab you by the feet and I drag you along the ground, you will hit every single thing on the road that will rip into your clothing and pull fibres out or pull bits out of it and cause it to wear through. But if you're doing 100 kilometres an hour or 60 miles an hour, you'll actually bounce like a ball because every little imperfection in the road that you hit will cause you to go a little bit airborne. Now, you might not actually leave the ground, but the amount of force that you're pushing that clothing into the ground with will reduce. And abrasion is, whether it's the big end of an engine or me rubbing my hand on a surface or two metal surfaces or clothing, abrasion is the area that we have and the force that we're pushing on it. So if we have less force pushing on it, but the same area, we will have less abrasion. So when we bounce, we actually cause less abrasion to occur. And so we found that it was actually physically a curve rather than a straight line. The faster you go, the less abrasion you get because you've got less pressure on the sample. And so this was quite interesting, but it still enabled us to say, okay, if we test a fabric at 28 kilometres an hour with a Cambridge abrasion tester, or 8 metres a second with a Cambridge abrasion tester, what we're measuring is the number of seconds it will last. Now, if we know that if it lasts 2 seconds, that is 16 metres. So 16 metres is, everyone can visualise that. If you fall off a motorcycle and you say you're going to slide 16 metres, or you fall off a motorcycle and you're going to slide 4 metres, you're going to want to be in the clothing that lasts 16. But if you fall off a motorcycle and you're in clothing that lasts 200 metres, well, that's probably more than you're ever going to need unless you're Valentino Rossi or someone like that. So it enables people to very quickly visualise abrasion distance. But by doing that bit of science of different speeds, we were able to understand that.
Okay, right, a very comprehensive answer again. The one thing we haven't talked about is the burst test that you do. Can you very quickly describe how that works?
So once again, this is the same test that is used in EN 13595. And it's a very common test in the textile industry. What we do is we clamp the textile fabric down over the top of a rubber diaphragm. We then pump hydraulic fluid underneath that diaphragm to expand it up like you would blow up a rubber balloon, but using hydraulic fluid. So we can put a large amount of force on there. And then we measure how much force it takes for the seam to burst open, or of course the fabric to burst open in that area. And so the diameter of our test samples is approximately 100 millimeters in diameter. And we can get up to 2000 kPa of pressure on the fabric in that measurement area. And so we measure how much force it takes to physically burst open the seam. We measure seams from all the critical parts in the body of the garment, all the critical seams. So the ones that would hold the side of a garment together, the ones that would hold the side of the leg together, the ones that will hold the arm onto the body of the garment, the ones that hold the seams together in these high-risk critical zones. And we average them out, and we come up with a star rating on that. Or with each of the individual ones, we come up with a rating out of 10. Our seam strength is one that people get quite good. And so most of the clothing we're measuring has quite good seam strength. We have one slight variation on the original EN 13595 test though. Roderick was a big believer that you had to cut any seams that were visible to the outside of the garment, because as you slide down the road, you're going to wear through the seams and then the fabric is more likely to burst open. But from all of the science that we've done, we know that burst is going to occur in the first 10 to 20 milliseconds of a crash. It's very unlikely for it to occur later on. So we don't penalise a garment by cutting any of the external seams. We only measure the actual seam strength, because that's what's going to be in place when it really matters.
Okay, good. So the MotoCAP standard also looks at comfort and waterproof properties of garments. Okay, we get a lot of rain here in the UK, although we've had a bit of a drought for the last month, believe it or not. Why would UK riders be interested in the thermal properties, putting it from our perspective over here, Northern Hemisphere?
So thermal properties, if you look at it, MotoCAP is designed for an Australian and New Zealand environment, and both of those are quite hot. It's coming on to winter at the moment, and I have no heating at the moment in my shed. I've been wearing a short sleeve shirt all day. It will get cold enough tonight that I'll need a jacket, but quite often when we ride, we will get thermal stress. What we do is we measure our clothing that we're testing using the same method that they use for sports clothing, which is essentially an artificial skin. It sweats like a normal skin, it lets moisture out like a normal skin. And so what we're measuring is the ability for the garment to let sweat out. Now, for someone riding in minus 20 degrees Celsius conditions, that's probably not that relevant, but comfort of a garment comes about from the ability for that garment to let out moisture. Now, if you've ever put on your wet weather jacket inside your house and felt really hot and wet and sticky before you go out, that's because that breathable layer is not that good. And so what we're measuring is how good that breathable layer is, and it just gives people a little bit more information on how comfortable a garment will be to wear. And I know that even riding at 25 degrees Celsius, you can get uncomfortable from heat from the wrong sort of garment. And we know that comfort has an effect on rider cognitive functions or ability to handle the motorbike appropriately. And so heat stress is an important component, especially if you're riding for longer distances. Now, the only test that we have developed for the whole of MotoCAP is our water spray test. What we do is we clad our mannequin that we have in the laboratory called Richie in motorcycle clothing. But first of all, we put a set of wet weather clothing on underneath. A set of cotton underwear on underneath. So long cotton underwear that goes all the way to the wrist, cotton gloves, cotton pants. We dress him in that. We then dress the motorcycle clothing over the top. We sit the mannequin on a CB125 motorcycle, and we pressure wash it for 20 minutes from a certain distance away with the right speed and the right pressure of water and so forth. And with this, what we're able to measure is the suitability of the garment for actual use, because a lot of companies that manufacture wet weather gear will tell you how good the fabric is or how good the seams are, but they don't consider how well they have made the neckline on the garment, or what we tend to find is where they have an external fabric and then a internal floating waterproof liner. Sometimes that zone can actually fill up with water. And I was actually doing a report for a garment the other day that was like that. It had this floating liner, and it was wet around the waist and also wet around the wrist here. Because what would happen is the water would build up in the arm of the garment, and then it would float. Because you had maybe half a litre in the wrist area, it would make its way through the fabrics of the wrist around and then back into the garment again and wet from the wrist up. Even though it had a really good glove on it that was stopping the water coming in, the design of the garment allowed water to come in. And so this enables us to measure wet weather. That information doesn't have anything to do with the protection or the comfort rating. It's just information for the rider on the wet weather of the protection of the garment, because not all garments are wet weather garments. Leather jackets and denim pants and most gloves aren't waterproof. And if we had have included the waterproofing as part of the rating, it would have unfairly penalised garments. So we don't include it as part of the comfort or protection rating.
Okay, great. Right, I think we're probably moving towards the end of the interview now. Story that skipped past me, you need to put me on your press releases, Chris, was that MotoCAP won an FIM, that's the International Federation of Motorcycling, Road Safety Award back in December 2019. Do you feel that's a vindication of your efforts?
We were very, very, very happy to be nominated and then to win that award. For us, MotoCAP is an Australian and New Zealand incentive, but a lot of riders would realise that the Italian-made jacket that's sold in Melbourne is exactly the same as that same manufacturer's jacket that's sold in Brazil or America or the UK. And so for us, we would like to see MotoCAP grow over time. We're doing 10% of the market at the moment. We really like to see that get to maybe 30 or 40% of the yearly market, because given carryover of products in stores, it would mean that we would get to pretty much everything in hanging in store would be certified. And so for that to happen, we need to get recognition outside of Australia and outside of New Zealand. We know that that's occurring. The web monkeys can tell you where people generically accessing things from. And so we know that we're not just restricted to Australia and New Zealand for people looking at MotoCAP. And over time, we hope that riders in Europe will say, oh, look, the standard's good for us, but we really want that little bit of extra information on what we're buying. And we get that from something like MotoCAP, and for that to go further. And if we look at it with cars, there are standards out there for the design build of cars, yet we still have a rating system, Euro NCAP, or in Australia it's ANCAP, for rating the protection of a car. And the two of those run side by side without any trouble. And for us, and Sharp and Crash for helmet star ratings run alongside the helmet standard quite happily. And so for us, we want to see eventually manufacturers embracing MotoCAP, starting to design more protective garments that riders are looking for, and to make it that people out there have confidence in what they're buying.
Do you have a roadmap where MotoCAP goes next then?
At the moment, I run the testing laboratory for where MotoCAP is tested. There is actually a group in New South Wales that administer MotoCAP on behalf of all of the parties. They are the ones that will actually set where it goes. There is discussion that there is hope that one day it will include footwear, and there is discussion that one day there will be an expansion, but unfortunately I can't say much on it because it's not my mission to actually talk about that particular component.
Okay, no worries. I gather you've got a new bike. What is it? What have you been doing on it, and what kind of riding have you been doing this year?
Well, you can see most predominantly in the image at the back there is my old 1953 BSA Denim, but I ride most of the time. I ride around on a GB 400 Honda, but I was very fortunate last year when I was in New Zealand doing the Shiny Side Up tour that they have to be loaned a Yamaha XSR 700, and they actually loaned the same bike to me again this year. So I've done 10,500 kilometres on that motorcycle around New Zealand, which was very, very pleasant. I've put more kilometres on the motorbike than anyone else has, but I fell in love with the bike, and now I have, you'll see in the background just behind me, a nice green Yamaha XSR 700. I went down that path. I'm not a believer in having the biggest bike in the world. I like a nicer, smaller cafe racer style bike. But I went down the path of a new bike because I really wanted a ABS and a little bit more power than what I had in the GP. And it was quite incredible how much difference the extra grip of the big tyres and the extra stopping power of that extra disc had on the motorbike for me, especially when I was practicing a few of my emergency braking. The XSR stops significantly better and in shorter distance than what the GB does, and you can really just grab once you get that initial go of the brakes and the diving down the motorbike. You really grab on that brake and just keep squeezing, and you can stop significantly better than what you could from a non-ABS bike. So I'm very happy. I spent a fair bit of time in New Zealand this year. I did the Coromandel Loop and rode to the top of New Zealand on the North Island, but I live very close to the Great Ocean Road. I'm guessing that was a cat going across the screen there. I live very close to the Great Ocean Road, and before we got locked down, I would ride quite often. I might get lost on the way home from work and ride home via the Great Ocean Road to get home, which is an hour-and-a-half trip rather than the half-hour motorway trip that I would normally take. So.
Okay, excellent. All right, one final question. Any dream bikes that your garage is currently missing?
Oh, well, I could put multiple motorcycles into my garage, and it will over time slowly get more in here. I'd love to have a Velocette Mac. I do like my old motorcycles. I would love to have one of the new Triumph Thruxton R's. And you'll notice there's a real cafe racer style look in there. The BMW R9T is another motorcycle I wouldn't mind having here. But I would really kill to have my RZ500 back sitting in the shed as well. Although I don't think I would want to ride it. I know how hairy, scary it was when I was young, and I don't know whether I'd really want to ride one now. But the thought of having one sitting here would be quite enjoyable as well. So.
Right. Okay. Well. All right. Yes, I remember those. That was, we called them the RD 500 over here, but yeah, it was the what was it, a 4-cylinder 2-stroke, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah,
it was essentially two what you would have called RDs over there. We called them RZ 250s over here, which was an inline 2-stroke 250cc motorcycle. They took the two of them and added them together in a V form to give you a 4-cylinder V4 500cc 2-stroke with very, very silly front fork angles that meant that all you had to do was look at it wrong and it would tank slap on you, especially halfway through a corner. If you didn't have a dampening beam on it and done up rather tight, then you would be in all sorts of trouble. And my mate, two of my friends and myself all had one, and we were reminiscing the other day, and one of my mates explained how he put his down because he'd been riding it a lot of open road and he had the dampener bar done up that much that he come into a corner, and when he went to go around it, he had no steering at all really, and he just fell over on the road because he had no steering to go through the roundabout. So yeah, that incredible bike for their time, but probably that XSR 700 there is not anywhere near as stupidly quick as what that bike was, but handling wise, it's probably a more enjoyable bike to ride. So
yeah, that's a huge step that motorcycles have taken over the last 20-30 years. Right. Okay. Well, Chris, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's very much appreciated, and I'm absolutely certain that viewers will have got a fantastic amount of information about what you've been doing to improve standards for motorcycle clothing. So very, very grateful to you for spending time here today, and we'll hopefully catch up at some point in the future. But again, thanks very much to you.
More than happy to have another talk at some stage, Kevin, especially when I bring out the work that we did with the on-road, and hopefully we'll get some video online on YouTube for that so that people can have a bit of a look at that.
Okay, well, we'll sign off here then. Okay, bye.